The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Windsor Castle, as Sergeant William Thompson adjusted his red tunic for what he believed would be just another ordinary day of royal duty. At 42 years old, William had served the Royal Guard for nearly 2 decades, standing motionless for hours, protecting the royal family with unwavering dedication. His weathered face bore the marks of countless ceremonies, state visits, and public appearances where he had remained as still as a statue, never breaking protocol. William's routine was precise and unchanging. Each morning at 5:30, he would rise in his modest quarters, polish his boots until they gleamed like mirrors, and prepare his uniform with military precision. His bearskin hat, though heavy and warm, had become as familiar to him as his own skin. The weight of tradition rested on his shoulders just as heavily as the ceremonial uniform he wore with such pride. On this particular Tuesday morning, something felt different in the air. Perhaps it was the way the autumn wind whispered through the ancient stones, or maybe it was the unusual quietness that seemed to settle over the castle grounds. William couldn't quite place the feeling, but his instincts, honed by years of service, told him that today would be unlike any other. As he made his way to his assigned post near the royal apartments, William's mind wandered to his own family. His wife Sarah had been battling a serious illness for months, and their 8-year-old daughter Emma had been asking difficult questions about why her mother was always tired and why Daddy had to work so much. The medical bills were mounting, and despite his loyal service, William's salary barely covered the growing expenses. He had applied for additional shifts and overtime whenever possible, but the financial strain was beginning to show. The other guards had noticed William's distraction lately. His usually perfect posture sometimes wavered during long ceremonies, and dark circles under his eyes betrayed sleepless nights spent worrying about his family's future. Yet he never complained, never asked for special consideration. His dedication to duty remained absolute, even as his personal world crumbled around him. Prince George, now 10 years old, had been observing the guards with growing curiosity over the past few months. Unlike many children his age who might take the constant presence of security for granted, George had developed a genuine interest in the men and women who dedicated their lives to protecting his family. He had begun to notice small details that others overlooked: the way guards shifted their weight during long ceremonies, how their eyes tracked movement even while staring straight ahead, and most recently, how one particular guard seemed different from the others. William's post that morning was directly outside the wing, where Prince George often played or studied. The young prince had noticed this guard before, recognizing him by a small scar above his left eyebrow and the particular way he held his shoulders. But today, George observed something that troubled him deeply. As William stood at attention, a single tear had escaped down his cheek, quickly wiped away when he thought no one was looking. The prince had been raised to notice such things, taught by his parents to be aware of the people around him and to understand that everyone, regardless of their role, was a human being with their own struggles and emotions. His father, Prince William, had often spoken about the importance of empathy and recognizing the sacrifices made by those who served their family and country. George found himself unable to concentrate on his lessons that morning. His tutor noticed his distraction as the young prince kept glancing toward the window, watching the guard who stood so perfectly still yet somehow seemed to be carrying an enormous burden. The mathematics problems and history lessons that usually engaged him felt trivial compared to the mystery of why this strong, proud man appeared to be struggling with something so difficult that it moved him to tears. During his lunch break, George made an excuse to walk past William's post. He slowed his pace, pretending to examine the architectural details of the corridor, while actually studying the guard's face. What he saw there was a mixture of professional stoicism and barely contained emotional pain. The contrast struck the young prince as profoundly unfair. Here was a man dedicating his life to protecting others while clearly needing help himself. That evening, as George sat with his family for dinner, he found himself unusually quiet. When his mother asked about his day, he mentioned seeing one of the guards who seemed sad. His parents exchanged a knowing glance, understanding that their son's empathetic nature was developing in exactly the way they had hoped. They encouraged him to think about what might cause someone to be unhappy, and whether there was anything that could be done to help. As night fell over Windsor Castle, William completed his shift and returned to his quarters. He called his wife as he did every evening, listening to her weak voice as she tried to sound cheerful despite her obvious fatigue. Emma got on the phone to tell her father about her school day, her innocent chatter a bright spot in his increasingly dark world. After hanging up, William sat on his narrow bed, staring at the stack of medical bills on his small desk, wondering how much longer he could continue to serve with honor while his family suffered. Meanwhile, in his comfortable bedroom, Prince George lay awake thinking about the guard with the sad eyes. He had learned about duty and service from his parents, but he was beginning to understand that sometimes serving others came at great personal cost. The image of that single tear rolling down the guard's weathered cheek haunted him, and he knew that somehow he needed to find a way to help. Little did he know that his natural compassion was about to set in motion a chain of events that would change everything for William Thompson and touch the hearts of people around the world. The next morning brought another gray autumn day to Windsor Castle, but for Prince George, it marked the beginning of what he would later call his mission of understanding. He had spent the previous evening researching the Royal Guard, reading about their training, their duties, and their personal sacrifices. What he discovered both amazed and troubled him. These men and women gave up normal family lives, worked long hours in all weather conditions, and received modest pay for their extraordinary dedication. George decided he needed to learn more about the specific guard who had caught his attention. During his morning walk with his protection officer, he casually asked about the guards and their backgrounds. His officer, Detective Inspector Martin Clark, was initially surprised by the prince's sudden interest, but was happy to share what he knew. The guards, he explained, were carefully selected individuals with impeccable records, most having served in various military units before joining the Royal Guard. As they passed William's post, George noticed that the guard's uniform was immaculate as always, but his eyes still held that same sadness from the day before. The prince slowed his pace, and in a moment that would later be remembered by many, he made direct eye contact with William. Instead of simply walking past as royal protocol typically demanded, George offered a small, genuine smile and a barely perceptible nod of acknowledgement. William was stunned by this unexpected recognition. In nearly 20 years of service, he had maintained professional distance from the royal family, speaking only when spoken to and never expecting personal acknowledgement for simply doing his job. The young prince's smile, brief as it was, reached something deep inside him. For a moment, the weight of his personal troubles seemed lighter, replaced by a warmth he hadn't felt in months. Throughout the day, George found himself thinking about that moment of connection. He began to understand that his position as a member of the royal family gave him not just privileges, but also opportunities to make a difference in people's lives. That evening, he approached his father with a carefully thought-out question about the guards and their welfare. Prince William listened carefully as his son explained his observations and concerns. He was proud of George's empathetic awareness, but also wanted to ensure his son understood the complexities of royal protocol and the importance of maintaining appropriate boundaries. However, he agreed that showing appreciation for loyal service was not only appropriate but necessary. The conversation led to Prince William sharing stories of his own, military service and the bonds he had formed with fellow servicemen. He explained how small gestures of recognition could mean everything to someone who was struggling, and how leadership often meant noticing things that others might miss. George absorbed every word, his determination to help growing stronger. Meanwhile, William's situation at home was becoming increasingly desperate. His wife Sarah had taken a turn for the worse, requiring more expensive treatments that their insurance only partially covered. The specialist recommended a procedure that could help, but the cost was astronomical. William found himself working extra shifts whenever possible, but the physical and emotional exhaustion was beginning to affect his performance. Other guards had begun to notice changes in William's demeanor. Sergeant Major Robert Hayes, a 30-year veteran who had served alongside William for over a decade, pulled him aside one evening. In the quiet privacy of the guard's common room, Robert asked directly if everything was all right at home. William's composure finally cracked, and he shared the full extent of his family's medical crisis. Robert listened without judgment, understanding the impossible position his colleague was in. The Royal Guard had protocols about financial difficulties that could potentially compromise security, But Robert also knew William's character was beyond reproach. He promised to speak discreetly with their commanding officer about possible assistance programs, though both men knew the options were limited. Prince George's newfound awareness extended beyond just William. Over the following days, he began observing all the castle staff with new eyes. He noticed the early morning cleaning crews, the kitchen staff who prepared meals before dawn, and the maintenance workers who kept the historic buildings in perfect condition. Each person had a story. Each face reflected both pride in their work and the universal human struggles that affect everyone, regardless of their role in serving the crown. The young prince started a private notebook where he recorded his observations, not to spy or report on anyone, but to better understand the lives of the people around him. He wrote about the gardener who always hummed while working despite clearly having an injured back, the maid who smiled cheerfully even though she seemed worried about something, and especially about the guard with the kind eyes who carried sadness like a heavy burden. George's behavioral changes did not go unnoticed by his tutors and family members. His questions during lessons became more thoughtful, often relating to social responsibility and the role of leadership in caring for others. When studying history, he asked about how past monarchs had related to their servants and subjects. During current events discussions, he wanted to understand economic inequality and healthcare challenges. His parents recognized that their son was developing exactly the kind of social consciousness they hoped he would possess as a future leader. However, they also knew they needed to guide his impulses carefully, ensuring that his desire to help didn't create unintended consequences or compromise the dignity of those he wished to assist. One evening, as autumn rain drummed against the castle windows, Prince George made a decision that would change everything. He had been watching William during a particularly long ceremony earlier that day, noting how the guard had stood perfectly still for over 3 hours while clearly struggling with something that made his hands shake slightly. The prince had seen enough. It was time to act, but he knew he needed to do it in a way that would truly help rather than simply make himself feel better. As he prepared for bed that night, George began planning what he would later describe as the most important gesture of his young life. He understood that sometimes the most powerful actions were the quietest ones, and that true compassion required careful thought rather than impulsive emotions. The seeds of an idea were forming in his mind, one that would honor both his position and his genuine desire to help a man who had dedicated his life to serving others. The plan that formed in Prince George's mind was both simple and profound. He had learned from his parents that the most meaningful gestures often came not from grand announcements or public displays, but from quiet moments of genuine human connection. After days of careful observation and thoughtful consideration, he knew exactly what he wanted to do. George spent the next morning working with his private secretary to arrange something that had never happened before in the modern history of the Royal Guard. He requested a private, informal meeting with Sergeant William Thompson, not as a prince receiving a briefing from security personnel, but as one human being reaching out to another. His request was so unusual that it required approval from his parents and consultation with the castle's security protocols. Prince William and Catherine were initially concerned about their son's request. While they admired his compassion, they needed to ensure that such a meeting wouldn't place either George or William in an awkward position. After careful consideration and discussion with senior staff, they agreed to allow the meeting, with the understanding that it would be brief and appropriately supervised. The arrangement was made through Sergeant Major Hayes, who approached William with careful discretion. William was initially terrified by the summons, assuming he had somehow failed in his duties or violated protocol. When Hayes explained that Prince George had specifically requested to speak with him, William's confusion only deepened. In 20 years of service, he had never heard of such a thing happening. The meeting was scheduled for a quiet afternoon in one of the castle's smaller sitting rooms, a space that felt more like a comfortable library than a formal royal chamber. Prince George arrived first, having spent considerable time thinking about how to approach the conversation. He understood that William would likely be nervous and formal, and he wanted to create an atmosphere where genuine communication could occur. When William entered the room, his military bearing was perfect despite his obvious nervousness. He stood at attention, prepared to respond to whatever questions or concerns the young prince might have. What happened next would remain etched in his memory forever. Prince George stood up from his chair, and with a maturity that belied his 10 years, spoke in a calm, respectful voice. He began by thanking William for his years of dedicated service, acknowledging the sacrifices that he and other guards made every day. But then he did something completely unexpected. He asked William to sit down, explaining that he had requested this meeting not because of any official business, but because he had noticed that William seemed to be carrying a heavy burden. The directness and genuine concern in the young prince's voice caught William completely off guard. He had been prepared for questions about security protocols or perhaps a formal commendation ceremony, but nothing had prepared him for this moment of pure human compassion. As he carefully took a seat, maintaining proper posture despite his emotional turmoil, William felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. George continued speaking, explaining that he had been learning about the importance of looking after the people who dedicated their lives to serving others. He had been taught that leadership meant recognizing when someone needed help and finding appropriate ways to offer support. With a wisdom that seemed far beyond his years, he acknowledged that he didn't know the specific nature of William's troubles, but he wanted William to know that his service was valued and that he didn't have to face his challenges alone. William struggled to maintain his composure as the young prince spoke. The kindness in George's voice, the genuine concern in his eyes, and the unprecedented nature of this conversation combined to create an emotional moment that threatened to overwhelm his professional restraint. When George finished speaking and asked if there was anything he could do to help, William made a decision that would change both their lives. Breaking with every protocol he had ever learned, William began to speak honestly about his situation. He told Prince George about his wife's illness, about the mounting medical bills, and about the impossible choice between his duty to the crown and his duty to his family. He spoke about the sleepless nights, the constant worry, and the growing fear that he might lose everything despite his years of loyal service. George listened with an intensity and understanding that amazed the adults who were discreetly supervising the meeting. He asked thoughtful questions about Sarah's condition and about Emma, William's daughter. When William mentioned that Emma had been asking why her father looked so sad lately, George's own eyes filled with tears of empathy. The conversation that followed lasted much longer than anyone had anticipated. George learned about the realities of life for working families facing medical crises, while William discovered that even young members of the royal family could possess remarkable wisdom and compassion. They talked about duty, about family, and about the different ways people serve their communities and support each other. As their meeting drew to a close, Prince George made a promise that would soon resonate far beyond the walls of Windsor Castle. He told William that while he couldn't solve all his problems immediately, he could ensure that William's dedication and sacrifice would not go unnoticed. The prince explained that he had been learning about the power of bringing attention to important issues, and that sometimes the best way to help one person was to shine a light on problems that affected many people. William left the meeting feeling transformed. For the first time in months, he felt that someone truly understood his situation and cared about his welfare as a human being, rather than simply as a uniformed protector. The young prince had given him something more valuable than money or immediate solutions. He had given him dignity, respect, and hope. That evening, Prince George sat down with his parents to discuss the conversation in detail. He shared what he had learned about William's situation and expressed his desire to find a meaningful way to help. His parents were moved by their son's maturity and his genuine concern for others, but they also knew that any action they took needed to be carefully considered to ensure it truly helped, rather than creating additional problems. As the family discussed possible approaches, Prince George suggested something that would soon capture the imagination of people around the world. He proposed a gesture so simple yet so powerful that it would demonstrate the true meaning of compassion and leadership. His idea would not only help William's family, but would also inspire countless others to recognize and support the unsung heroes who serve their communities every day. Prince George's idea was elegant in its simplicity, yet revolutionary in its implications. He proposed to publicly acknowledge William's service in a way that would not single him out for his personal struggles, but would instead highlight the dedication of all royal guards and the challenges faced by families who serve their country. The gesture he envisioned would be silent, respectful, and profoundly meaningful. The plan required careful coordination with palace officials, security personnel, and media representatives. Prince George wanted to attend the next formal changing of the guard ceremony, but instead of simply observing from the royal viewing area as was traditional, he requested permission to participate in a small but significant way that would honor the guard's service. His proposal was to present each guard with a personal letter of thanks, written in his own hand, acknowledging their dedication and sacrifice. Additionally, he wanted to announce the establishment of a support fund for royal staff and their families facing medical emergencies, with an initial contribution from his own trust fund that had been set up for charitable purposes. The announcement of Prince George's planned gesture spread quickly through the castle staff. Word reached William through Sergeant Major Hayes, who explained that the young prince had been so moved by their conversation that he wanted to do something meaningful for all the guards and their families. William was overwhelmed by the realization that his personal struggles had inspired such a thoughtful response. Preparations for the ceremony took several days. Prince George spent hours writing individual letters to each member of the royal guard, personalizing each message based on information about their service records and personal circumstances that had been discreetly gathered through appropriate channels. His parents helped him understand the importance of acknowledging each person's unique contribution while maintaining the dignity and privacy that each deserved. The media was informed about the upcoming ceremony but was asked to focus on the broader message of supporting service families, rather than speculating about specific individuals who might be facing difficulties. The palace's communications team emphasized that this gesture represented Prince George's growing understanding of his future role and his commitment to recognizing those who dedicate their lives to public service. On the morning of the ceremony, William prepared for duty with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. He had no idea that his conversation with Prince George would lead to such a public acknowledgement, and he worried about how his fellow guards might react. However, when he arrived at the assembly point, he found that his colleagues were excited and supportive, understanding that this recognition reflected well on all of them. The changing of the guard ceremony began as usual, with tourists and locals gathering to watch the traditional display of precision and pageantry. However, as the ceremony concluded, something unprecedented occurred. Prince George, accompanied by his parents, stepped forward to address the guards and the assembled crowd. Speaking with a clear, strong voice that carried across the courtyard, Prince George began by explaining that he had been learning about the importance of recognizing the people who serve their communities with dedication and honor. He spoke about the guards who protected his family, the staff who maintained the palace, and all the individuals whose quiet service made possible the work of the monarchy. As he spoke, William felt his throat tighten with emotion. The young prince's words were clearly heartfelt, and his message resonated not just with the guards but with everyone present. George talked about the sacrifices made by service families, the challenges they faced, and the importance of ensuring that those who gave so much in service to others received support when they needed it most. The moment that would be remembered by all present came when Prince George began, presenting his handwritten letters to each guard. As he approached William, the prince paused and looked directly into his eyes. Without breaking protocol or drawing undue attention to their previous conversation, George handed William his letter with a small nod that conveyed volumes of understanding and respect. William accepted the letter with hands that trembled slightly, not from nervousness but from the overwhelming realization that this 10-year-old prince had not only listened to his struggles, but had taken meaningful action to help. The letter, he would discover later, contained not just words of thanks but also information about resources available to him and his family through the newly established support fund. The ceremony continued, as Prince George presented letters to each guard. But the moment of connection between him and William had been observed by many in the crowd and captured by photographers. The image that would soon circulate around the world showed a young prince treating a veteran guard with profound respect and dignity, representing everything that was best about both tradition and compassion. Following the presentation of letters, Prince George announced the establishment of the Royal Service Families Support Fund, explaining that it would provide assistance to any royal staff member or their family facing medical emergencies or other serious difficulties. He emphasized that the fund was not charity but recognition that those who served others deserved support when they needed it most. The announcement was met with spontaneous applause from the crowd and visible emotion from the guards and other palace staff who were present. Many understood that this young prince was demonstrating a level of leadership and compassion that promised well for the future of the monarchy. After the ceremony, William returned to his quarters to read his letter in private. Prince George's words were carefully chosen and deeply personal, acknowledging William's years of faithful service and expressing hope that the support fund would help ensure that no member of the royal family's extended service community would have to choose between duty and family welfare. The letter also contained a personal note expressing George's gratitude for their conversation and his admiration for William's dedication to both his duty and his family. The prince had included information about how to access the support fund discreetly and professionally, ensuring that William's dignity would be preserved throughout the process. That evening, William called his wife to share the incredible news. Sarah's weak voice grew stronger as she listened to her husband describe the day's events and the support that was now available for her medical treatments. For the first time in months, they both felt that there might be a path forward that wouldn't require William to sacrifice his honor or his family's welfare. The story of Prince George's gesture spread quickly beyond Windsor Castle, capturing the attention of media outlets around the world. However, the focus remained on the positive message of supporting service families, rather than exploiting individual hardships. The young prince had achieved exactly what he had hoped: meaningful help for those who needed it, delivered with dignity and respect for everyone involved. The impact of Prince George's gesture extended far beyond the walls of Windsor Castle, in ways that no one could have anticipated. Within hours of the ceremony, news outlets around the world were reporting on the young prince's compassionate leadership. But more importantly, stories began emerging about similar support systems being established for service personnel in other organizations and countries. William's situation improved dramatically as he was able to access the support fund discreetly and professionally. The assistance covered his wife's medical treatments while preserving his dignity as both a husband and a dedicated member of the royal guard. Sarah's health began to stabilize with access to better medical care, and their daughter Emma started smiling more often as the stress in their household diminished. However, the most unexpected consequence of Prince George's actions was the effect it had on William's sense of purpose and dedication to his role. Rather than feeling like he owed the royal family a debt of gratitude, William felt renewed pride in serving an institution that truly cared about its people. His performance, which had been suffering under the weight of his personal worries, returned to its usual exceptional standard. The other guards had also been deeply moved by Prince George's recognition of their service. The handwritten letters each guard received were treasured personal mementos that many planned to pass down to their children. The establishment of the support fund had removed a source of anxiety that many had carried silently, knowing that their families would be protected if serious difficulties arose. Sergeant Major Hayes noticed a remarkable change in morale throughout the Royal Guard. The men and women under his command carried themselves with even greater pride, knowing that their service was not just acknowledged but truly valued by the family they protected. The ceremony had strengthened the bonds between the royal family and their security personnel in ways that no amount of formal recognition could have achieved. Prince George continued his regular routines, but his interaction with William had changed his perspective on his future role permanently. He began requesting more information about the various support systems and charitable organizations associated with the monarchy, wanting to understand how he could continue to make meaningful contributions to the lives of people who served others. His parents observed these changes with a mixture of pride and careful guidance. They helped George understand that leadership meant not just grand gestures but consistent attention to the welfare of others. They encouraged his developing sense of social responsibility while ensuring he maintained the proper balance between compassion and royal protocol. The media attention surrounding Prince George's gesture had been overwhelmingly positive, with commentators praising both his maturity and the values being instilled in him by his parents. However, the palace was careful to ensure that the focus remained on the broader message of supporting service families, rather than creating a cult of personality around the young prince. Several weeks after the ceremony, William requested a brief private meeting with Prince George to express his gratitude and to share how the prince's actions had affected his family. The meeting was arranged through proper channels, and when they met again in the same quiet sitting room where their first conversation had taken place, both had been changed by their experience. William brought with him a letter from his wife Sarah and a drawing from his daughter, Emma. Sarah's letter expressed her gratitude not just for the practical help they had received, but for the dignity with which it had been offered. She wrote about how Prince George's actions had restored her faith in the fundamental goodness of people and had given her family hope during their darkest time. Emma's drawing showed her father in his guard uniform, standing next to a young boy wearing a crown, both of them smiling under a rainbow. Her childish artwork captured the essence of what had transpired better than any formal documentation could have achieved. Two human beings from different worlds finding common ground in compassion and mutual respect. During their conversation, William shared how the support fund had enabled Sarah to receive the medical treatment she needed, and how their family's stress had decreased dramatically. He explained that he felt renewed pride in his service, knowing that he worked for people who genuinely cared about his welfare and that of his family. Prince George listened with the same intensity he had shown during their first meeting, asking thoughtful questions about Sarah's progress and Emma's adjustment to the improved situation at home. He expressed his happiness that the support fund was working as intended and asked if William had any suggestions for how it could be improved or expanded. Their conversation revealed that both had learned important lessons from their experience. William had gained a deeper appreciation for the human side of the royal family he served, while Prince George had learned that true leadership meant paying attention to the individual stories behind the uniforms and titles that surrounded him. As their meeting concluded, William made a decision that would surprise everyone, including himself. He told Prince George that their conversations and the prince's subsequent actions had inspired him to consider a significant change in his career. While he remained deeply committed to the Royal Guard, he felt called to help establish and manage support systems for other service personnel and their families. William explained that he wanted to use his experience and understanding of the challenges faced by service families to help create similar support networks in other organizations. He felt that Prince George's gesture had shown him a new way to serve, one that could extend his impact beyond his current role while still honoring his commitment to protecting and supporting others. Prince George was intrigued by William's idea and encouraged him to explore the possibility of developing such programs. The prince understood that sometimes the greatest impact came from inspiring others to create positive change, rather than trying to solve every problem personally. He promised to support William's efforts in whatever way was appropriate and possible. Their conversation ended with a mutual understanding that their initial meeting had created something larger than either had anticipated. Prince George's simple act of compassion had not only solved one family's immediate crisis, but had also inspired a broader movement towards supporting those who dedicate their lives to serving others. As William returned to his duties that day, he carried with him a new sense of purpose and possibility. The young prince, who had noticed his distress and acted with such wisdom and compassion, had given him more than financial support. He had given him a vision of how service could extend beyond traditional boundaries to create meaningful change in people's lives. 6 months after Prince George's ceremony, the Royal Service Family Support Fund had grown beyond anyone's expectations. Donations from the public, inspired by the young prince's example, had created a substantial resource that was helping dozens of families facing various challenges. The fund had become a model that other organizations were studying and adapting for their own personnel. William's wife, Sarah, had made a remarkable recovery thanks to the medical treatment she was able to receive through the support fund. Her strength had returned, and she had begun volunteering with other families facing similar medical crises. Emma had also flourished, her drawings now filled with bright colors and happy scenes that reflected the security and hope that had returned to their household. The transformation in William's life had been so profound that he made the difficult decision to request a transfer from active guard duty to a newly created position managing the support fund and developing similar programs for other service organizations. His years of experience, combined with his personal understanding of the challenges faced by service families, made him uniquely qualified for this role. Prince George supported William's career change enthusiastically, understanding that sometimes helping one person could create a ripple effect that helped countless others. The prince had continued his own development, learning more about social issues and the various ways that leadership could address community needs effectively. The day of William's official transition ceremony was emotional for everyone involved. His fellow guards honored his 20 years of exemplary service while celebrating his move to a role where he could help even more families. Sergeant Major Hayes spoke about William's dedication and the positive example he had set for others, particularly in demonstrating that asking for help when needed was a sign of strength rather than weakness. Prince George attended the ceremony and spoke briefly about how William's story had taught him important lessons about leadership, compassion, and the interconnectedness of human experience. He explained that helping William's family had led to the creation of a support system that was now helping many families, demonstrating how individual acts of kindness could grow into institutional change. During the ceremony, William announced his resignation from the Royal Guard to pursue his new role full-time, but he also shared something that surprised everyone present. He revealed that his experience with Prince George had inspired him to establish a non-profit organization dedicated to creating support networks for service families across different sectors, from military personnel to police officers, firefighters, and other emergency responders. The organization, which William planned to call the Service Family Support Network, would use the model developed through the Royal Support Fund to help other institutions create their own assistance programs. William explained that he wanted to honor Prince George's example by extending the reach of compassion and support to service families everywhere. Prince George was deeply moved by William's announcement, realizing that their initial conversation had created something far larger than either had imagined possible. The prince expressed his commitment to supporting William's new organization and suggested that the royal family might serve as patrons for the non-profit, lending their influence to help it grow and succeed. The ceremony concluded with William officially stepping down from his guard duties and accepting his new role as Director of Family Support Services for the royal household. As he removed his ceremonial uniform for the final time, many present were moved to tears, understanding that they were witnessing the end of one chapter and the beginning of another in a story of service and compassion. That evening, Prince George met privately with William one final time in their familiar sitting room. Both reflected on how their first conversation had led to changes neither could have anticipated. William expressed his gratitude not just for the practical help his family had received, but for the way Prince George had treated him with dignity and respect during his most vulnerable time. Prince George shared that William's story had taught him that true leadership meant seeing beyond titles and uniforms to recognize the humanity in every person. He explained that their interaction had shaped his understanding of his future role and his commitment to ensuring that the monarchy remained connected to and responsive to the needs of ordinary people. They prepared to part ways, both as guard and prince, and begin their new relationship as colleagues working toward similar goals. William presented Prince George with a special gift. It was a photograph of his family taken on the day Sarah received the medical clearance, indicating her full recovery. In the photo, Sarah, Emma, and William were all smiling broadly, standing in front of their modest home with a letter from the support fund visible in Sarah's hands. On the back of the photograph, William had written a simple message. "Thank you for seeing us as people first. Your kindness changed everything." Below that, Sarah had added her own note. "You gave us hope when we had none left." Emma had contributed a small drawing of a crown with a heart in the center. Prince George accepted the gift with deep emotion, understanding that it represented far more than a simple thank you. It symbolized the human connections that made service meaningful, and the ripple effects that could flow from simple acts of compassion and recognition. Years later, when Prince George had grown into his role as a senior member of the royal family, he would often tell the story of Sergeant William Thompson and the lesson that a single moment of human connection could teach about leadership and service. The Service Family Support Network that William founded had grown into an international organization helping thousands of families, all traceable back to a young prince's decision to notice and care about the struggles of one dedicated guard. The quiet sitting room at Windsor Castle where their conversations had taken place was eventually named the Thompson Room in in honor of William's service and the meaningful change that had begun there. A small plaque by the door read simply, "In recognition that leadership begins with noticing the humanity in those who serve." Prince George's silent gesture had indeed inspired more than just William's resignation from the royal guard. It had inspired the creation of a new model for institutional compassion and support that would benefit service families for generations to come. The young prince had learned that sometimes the most profound changes begin with the simplest acts of human kindness, and that true leadership meant using one's position not just to command respect, but to show it to others.